This afternoon, we're going to talk about 3 of my favorite recent enhancements to Enterprise PDM, implementing parallel workflow transitions, and we'll go through a couple of different methods of doing that. We'll talk about the version-free variable type, and we'll also talk about a new feature in 2014 called automated cache management and how that better enables us to work with templates and design library and those things inside of SOLIDWORKS. To get started, the intended audience for this webinar are really Enterprise PDM administrators or power users, folks that have been involved with the setup or a planned rollout of Enterprise PDM in your company. We're going to talk about these concepts. We'll take a look at interface inside the administration tool, how to set these things up, how to manage them, and then, again, time for questions at the very end. Really, the concept of parallel approvals has been around much longer than the workflow transition type of the same name. Parallel approvals, of course, are when multiple users are going to be required to sign off on a given file before it gets approved, but we don't care about what the order that they sign off is in. So we don't have to go from this person to the next person to the next person. People can sign off in parallel. So we'd want to implement the parallel approval workflow to allow those approvers from various groups to sign off in any order. So we'll actually consider 2 different scenarios where parallel approval workflows might be used. The first is where we require one approver from every department. So engineering, quality, manufacturing, compliance, sales, every one of those must approve. The second option that we'll consider is when I require just a minimum number of people to approve. I'll call it minimum X approvals. To get an appreciation for how we set up these parallel approvals, we'll first talk about the traditional way, or the way that we've typically set these up in the past. So with my parallel transitions, the way that, or the prerequisites in order to get this set up is I'm going to need a temporary workflow state. I'm going to need one transition object in my workflow per particular approval. I'll need data card variables to capture each individual who signs off. We'll need to set up some transition actions to update those variables. And then we'll also take advantage of some automatic transitions and transition conditions in order to facilitate this logic. The first thing, as I mentioned, is a temporary workflow state. So as I go through and do my sign-offs, I've got a temporary state here. I'm calling it approval temp, and this is where then transition conditions are going to be evaluated and either looped back to the parallel department approver state or proceed forward into the approved state. You'll also notice that I've got one transition per approval. So my engineering users have one transition that they can be performing. Quality has a different transition. Manufacturing has a different transition. Compliance, sales, etc. I've got to set up data card variables for each sign-off. So when it goes through the engineering approval transition, I'm going to be setting a variable value for my engineering approval variable so that I can then take some logic here in my automatic transitions, and I apply a set of conditions that looks for blank values or looks for a set of values that are not blank. So let's go ahead and take a closer look at how we would go about doing that. So I happen to have an example here set up for my department approvals. As we mentioned, all the files are going to sit here in my department approvals state while the items are being reviewed and waiting for approval. So I've got my engineering approval here. You can see that currently my engineers are the only ones permitted to approve for engineering. And as an action, I've taken my set variable action. I've got an approval for engineering on my data card, and I'm filling it out with the user data field. Now, I use the user data field for a couple of purposes. We can use the login name, the user's initials, or any of the fields available to us in the user properties. But I like using that user data field because it gives me some flexibility as to what I actually type in here. If my naming convention for my drawings, I'm going to map these approvals onto the face of my drawing. It may have to be all caps. It may be first letter dot last name. It may just be last name. So we've got the flexibility to put any kind of information we want here in the user data field. So I treat this section of my user profile like a drawing name, for example. So whatever I type in here would be appropriate to show on the face of my drawing. The only thing that really matters when we're talking about our workflow conditions is that some value actually gets written here, because the conditions that we apply are going to check, does it have a value or not? It doesn't really care what that value happens to be. So similarly, if I look at quality, manufacturing, compliance, they're all the same setup where we've got a transition. Only a particular group is permitted to approve for that transition, and we're taking an action to set a variable. My file then comes down and is sitting in the approval temporary state. The icon that I've chosen is deliberate. Keep in mind that whenever a user right-clicks on a file and does a change state, the icon associated with that change state action is the icon of the destination state. So when I'm right-clicking on my file for engineering approval, I would see this checkbox, which makes sense in the context of what I'm doing. I actually don't have anything in particular set up on this state. There's no notifications, no revision numbers, no special permissions. All I'm using it for is to hold these files while I evaluate the transitions here. So I've got a loop transition, and the conditions here say if my approval compliance value is blank, okay, or if my engineering approval value is blank, or if my manufacturing approval, or if my quality approval, or if my sales approval. So if any one of those fields on my data card has no value, text is equal to blank, then I'm going to go ahead and loop back up into department approvals because not everyone has signed off yet. If everyone has signed off, it's going to go through this approval automatic transition. And in this case, I'm looking for almost the same conditions, okay, but this time it's text not equal to blank. And you'll also notice that I don't have that or statement. So this says approval compliance cannot be blank, and engineering compliance cannot be blank, and manufacturing, and sales, and quality cannot be blank. If any one of those are blank, then the entire condition is not satisfied, and we won't go through this approve automatic transition. The other thing that I should note here is that when setting up permissions, I do want to add all of those particular users to have permission to be able to perform this transition, because whomever signs off last, okay, that's the user whose permissions are going to be respected with these automatic transitions. So you want to make sure that everyone has the ability to perform these automatic transitions. Otherwise, it will get stuck in your temporary approval state. So as we're using them, okay, with that traditional method I just showed you, we're actually being shown however many groups that you belong to that you can approve for, you will actually see those different transitions listed here. If we compare that with the minimum number of approvals, I'll go through an example there where we actually will only see one option regardless of how many groups that we belong to. So if we look at the minimum X way of doing this, okay, it's structured actually very similarly to the department approvals method, but instead of using those group permissions to determine which approval transition path you follow, we have some additional transition conditions to sort this out. So if we take a look at what those actually look like, okay, instead of saying if quality is signed off, if engineering has signed off, we're just going to actually be writing a value to approval 1, approval 2, approval 3, okay, since I'm requiring a minimum of 3 approvals. And the approval that it follows is actually determined by if the other ones have values or not. So we just have some additional conditions to set in our workflow. So I'll show you what that looks like, and we'll go through this one from scratch. So in this case, I'm going to require a minimum of 3 approvals. So I'm going to start by creating a new transition, selecting my source and destination states, and I'll call this one approval. And I'll let all the appropriate users potentially approve for this, so I'll add those permissions there. And then I'm going to add my action here. It's going to be a set variable action, and I'm going to set my approval number 1. And just as before, I'm going to use my user data information to populate that field on the data card. Now, I also mentioned that we have to have some additional conditions here. I'll come back to those in just a minute. Let me set up my other 2 transitions here. So I've got my first one, and I can actually copy and paste my transitions. So if I copy this, right-click in the open space and hit paste, I can select my source and destination, and I can get my 3 approval transitions. They all have the same permissions associated with them, the same transition actions. So I'll just a moment here to clean this up, make it look a little cleaner. Now I have to go in here and adjust which variable we're updating. So instead of approval 1, in this case, I'll be updating approval 2. And my convention is always in the description to identify which variable we're actually updating. So if there's a number of variables that we're updating, it's quite obvious which one is which. And the third one here, I'll come in and we'll update approval 3. So those additional conditions that we talked about, the system needs to know which path to send the user down. Am I going to fill out this user's information in approval 1, approval 2, or approval 3? So we'll add some logic here, a new condition that says if approval 1 is equal to blank and approval 2 is equal to blank and approval 3 is equal to blank, then I want to go down this first path here. For the second transition, my conditions are going to say if approval 1 contains any value, and if approval 2 is equal to blank, and approval 3 is equal to blank, then go down this middle option that's filling out a value in approval 2. And my third option here is going to say if approval 1 contains any value, and if approval 2 contains any value, and approval 3 is blank, then I want you to go down this third path where we're setting the approval 3 variable. Similarly, I could use text not equals to blank or text contains anything. We've got a few options in terms of how we evaluate these conditions, but nonetheless, that's what we require. And then I'm going to create those automatic transitions. So again, new transition from approval temp back up to my review step. I'll call this one my loop. And the type is going to be automatic. I want to make sure that all my users who can do approvers are permitted to do so. And the conditions here is if, well, we'll use an OR statement first. So if approval 1 is equal to blank, or if approval 2 is equal to blank, or if approval 3 is equal to blank, then I want it to loop back up to the top. You'll notice that when I create a automatic transition, we have the lightning bolt out front designating this as an automatic transition. The transition also turns red. And then I'll create a second transition here. We'll make that one automatic as well. And the conditions here, these are AND conditions. So when approval 1 is not equal to blank, and approval 2 not equal to blank, and approval 3 not equals to blank, then we'll go through this transition here. And it will go ahead and become approved. So very similar structure. Again, the differences being in what it looks like to the users, and if we're going to require folks from certain departments. Right? Minimum X just means as long as I have 3 approvers, I don't care where they're from or what their particular role is. So if we look at some of the advantages of this traditional method for doing parallel transitions, approvals, of course, happen in parallel, and we're not stuck waiting on a single user. It's not sitting on manufacturing's desk for, 3 days before the next person can proceed with their review. Another advantage is we capture on the data card who's approved it. So we're recording that with the file on the data card that can be mapped back to the face of our drawing or the custom properties of our files. And then as well, if a file gets rejected, we can actually clear out all those approver values and start the process over again. The disadvantages, number one, it takes a while to set up. There's a bit of logic that has to be applied depending on the number of times, the number of approvers involved, and so it can be difficult to set up or modify. The other disadvantage is that a file version is created every time we approve, every time a single user approves a file, because it's actually updating the data card with that users with that user's name. So it's actually creating 5 versions of that file before it gets approved. So we're burning versions in the system, which has some implications in disk space and when you go back to the Git version and things like that. If we look now at those same 2 scenarios, but this time we'll use the parallel transition workflow object. That was a new type of transition in Enterprise PDM 2013. So the new parallel transition workflow type is actually pretty well suited to either method, parallel department approvals or the minimum X number of approvals, as well as a hybrid method if we wanted to combine some of those. We accomplish this by introducing a new concept into our permission schema, and it's called a role. And the role is only available in the parallel transition type. And they allow you to define how many users must approve for that particular role before the transition is allowed to complete. Looking at this workflow, which actually provides the exact same release process as our previous example, and much simpler to look at, there's really only 2 requirements here. We use the parallel transition type, and we use a new thing called a transition role. The parallel transition type is identified with a double green line and a checkbox or a check mark next to the transition name. The roles themselves allow us to define how many users from each role are going to be required to sign off, as well as which members or which users are members of which roles. For the end user, you'll only see a single transition option, as well as the number of current approvals and the total number of approvals needed. Once you've completed your state change action, you're then able to revoke or unvote your approval, and you can do that at any point up to when we achieve the minimum number of approvals required. In this case, on the left-hand side, you can see approval 0 of 8, meaning there's currently 0 approvals and 8 approvals are required. Once I've actually performed that state change, as my user, I can then revoke my approval. Since I'm only 1 of 8, I don't have 8 of 8 approvals yet. So let's take a look at how that's actually set up inside the administration tool. So we'll go back to our workflow editor. And over here, I've got my parallel approval process with my parallel type transition. Okay, so I choose that from the drop-down here. And then what I can do is add a role. So we'll call this the engineering approval role. And I can choose to add members from this role. I'll just happen to add all of my engineering group. And then I say how many users are required from this role. So if I need 2 engineers to sign off, I can click OK. And we see that there are 2 engineers required, even though there are 6 potential people in that role. I can add another role for quality, say, and add the managers as members and require only 1 user from there. So in this case, I now have 3 required signatures, 2 from engineering, 1 from quality, and then this item will go all the way through to approved. So there's some disadvantages to this method as well. The biggest one being we cannot write information to a data card through the parallel transition type. So we can't capture all the people who are actually signing off. Now, there are ways to do that using dispatch, using API. So there are a couple of ways to get around that, but using the out-of-the-box workflow editor, we're not going to be able to write user data to the cards. However, it's very easy to set up. There's no intermediate file version. So as people vote or approve or revoke their approval, that's not actually creating versions of our file. You can revoke it without actually rejecting the file outright. So other people can continue to approve even if you revoke your approval. And it's very easy to set up and modify. So again, there's merits to both methods for implementing parallel approval workflows. If you do need to capture all the electronic signatures and write their names to custom property values to use on the face of your drawing, as of now, you're fairly tied into that traditional method. However, again, if your processes permit that your records are maintained in PDM and don't have to be maintained on the face of your drawing, then I would definitely encourage the use of the parallel transition type. Again, reduced administrative overhead, really easily scalable going forward. So we'll switch gears a little bit and take a look at the capabilities of the version-free variable. Now, when I was out doing implementations with customers, this was actually a very common request to be able to change variables without having to check them out and update the versions. So really, when might you consider using a version-free variable? Well, these types of variables are really best suited for values that may change frequently without actually impacting the geometry or the integrity of the model, and values that don't require mapping to custom properties. So they're not used in the title block of your drawings. Commonly, these values are for reference only. They may be there to display values controlled by other systems or other processes that might just be convenient to be associated with a file. For example, something like cost or preferred manufacturer. These are values that may change, but they don't impact the geometry of your file. They don't impact the references to other files. They really, in my opinion, don't necessitate a new version of our file. So cost, approved manufacturer, preferred manufacturer. This new type of variable does not require users to be able to check out the file in order to modify it. However, there are some new permissions that need to be set for administrators to be aware of. So we can set up a version-free variable. There's a couple of things to note. So when we create a version-free variable, we're going to do that from the exact same variables interface in the administration tool. When you do define a variable as version-free, notice there's no options for mapping file attributes. And that's because when we map a file to an attribute, to a custom property in our file, we're physically changing the file. And by rule, that necessitates a new file version. Secondly, I've got an option to allow the version-free variable to either update all versions of the variable with the new value, or just the latest version of the file. The difference between these two options, when selecting all versions, whenever you retrieve an earlier version of the file, that current version or the current value from your version-free variable will be displayed. If you select latest version, the value is applied only to the latest version of the file, and earlier versions of that file may display a different value, whatever value was applied at the time that version was created. Again, the considerations there, we cannot map them to custom properties. Users have state and folder permissions that need to be set in order to edit a version-free variable. And if a version-free variable is updated as part of a workflow transition, it will actually create a new version of that file. And lastly, the file history will maintain a log when a version-free variable is modified. So it'll keep track of who changed it, when did they change it, but it will not keep a history of what that previous value was, or what it was changed to. Lastly, we'll talk a bit about automated cache management. This was a new feature added in EPDM 2014, and it allows administrators to designate folders either to get the latest version of everything in that folder upon login, or clear the cache upon logout. I see this traditionally used for, or most commonly used for, templates, design library, and historically I've had to recommend customers to keep those templates, blocks, design library components outside of Enterprise PDM. The reason being, those portions of the SOLIDWORKS application don't recognize files which aren't locally cached on the user system. So if we were maintaining templates in Enterprise PDM, whenever a template got changed or updated, administrator would have to send out an email to all the users saying, please, get latest on this folder. We've made some changes, and they got to cross your fingers that people actually do that and start using the new versions of these files, and that rarely ever worked out. So now, as those files get updated, users don't even have to think about it, and they're automatically provided with the latest information of those files when they log in next time. So it is a group permission called cache options, and I'll show you where to set that. Here, if I come in to my groups, I'll look at my engineering users, and similar to how we set folder permissions, I get a list of all the folders in my vault, and I can come in here, and the two options that I have is refresh cache during login, so this will get the latest of anything that's in this particular folder. The other option I have is to clear the cache of a particular folder when you log out. So if you have multiple users that share a computer that are commonly logging in, logging out, and you want to, minimize what those users have stored on their local cache, you can actually have it clear out the cache of the non-checked out files when the user logs out. Assigned cache options is another way of viewing the exact same information. So it specifies, or it shows you any folders that have specifically been identified to automatically cache these files. And that happens during login. So if I come in here, I'll show you here in my demo folder. I had my library, my electrical components. You'll notice, well, let me clear my cache of this particular folder, so that I don't actually have local copies of any of these files. Okay, let me go ahead and log off, and I'll log back in as a user that has automated cache set up. And as I go in, you saw it briefly popped up, that Get Latest dialog box. And as I come in here to my electrical components, we can see that I do have those local copies of those files. So again, it happens automatically without the user ever thinking about it. So I want to thank you for spending time with us this afternoon to get some tips and better insight as to how you can use parallel workflow transitions, version-free variables, automatic cache management. Feel free to email me any follow-up questions, and I'm happy to address those via email. Thanks again for joining our Tips and Tricks webinar this week.